Welcome. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown. I'm the Reverend Kerry Mueller, minister here with the Reverend Dave Hunter. We are not closed, but we are meeting virtually, and we welcome you whether you are joining us on Zoom this morning for the first time or for the 100th time or the many, many times in your life, or whether you're coming from some other time and place via YouTube. Special thanks this morning to our pianist, Carly Schell, to Mary Ryan, the keeper of the Flaming Chalice, and Rick Dusky, who manages all things internet and electronic. With the chimes, we remind ourselves to put our phones onto airplane mode or worship mode and to settle in for a time together. The opening words this morning are from the Reverend Kathleen McTeague, a Unitarian Universalist minister. She says, "We come together this morning to remind one another to rest for a moment on the forming edges of our lives, to resist the headlong tumble into the next moment until we claim for ourselves awareness and gratitude, taking the time to look into one another's faces and see their communion, the reflection of our own eyes. This virtual house of laughter and silence, memory and hope is hallowed by our presence together." Are there announcements this morning? I think we should have a celebration, our first time without announcements. And now, if Mary will light the chalice, I will remind us that we light the chalice this morning for all of those suffering from mental illness, for their friends and families, and for those who are entrusted with their care. Here's a responsive reading that Dave and I will share. It's written by Marge Piercy, a well-known poet and novelist. And it's on the subject of usefulness. And I want to say what Dorothea Dix first wrote about the subject of usefulness. "What greater bliss than to look back on days spent in usefulness, in doing good to those around you, in fitting young spirits for their native skies." Dave, would you like to start, please?
I want to be with people who submerge in the task,
"Who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along.
who stand in the line and haul in their places,
Who were not parlor generals and field deserters, but more in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out.
The work of the world is common as mud, botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust.
But the thing worth doing, well done, has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident.
Greek aphoras for wine or oil, hoppy vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used.
The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." As we celebrate Women's History Month, we honor the women who have brought us to this day. This week brought us Equal Pay Day, recognizing the ongoing inequality of pay between men and women. Carly will play an anthem for us, the anthem of the rights of women and workers. It's often called Bread and Roses, number 102, "As We Come Marching, Marching." Carly? Thank you, Carly. At this time in our service, we take a few moments to share those moments of joy and sorrow, times of gratitude and times of hope. If you would like to share a special moment in your life, I invite you now to unmute and share a few words with us. And I will drop a stone into the bowl of water. And as its ripples spread throughout the bowl, the currents of your life will spread through this community. Does anyone have anything to share this morning? Yes, Dave.
It's my birthday. Today I'm 79.
Happy birthday, Dave.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Well, there's another joy in our household is that we both had our second Pfizer shot on Thursday. So we're now in a countdown to being able to go out and about a little more.
Okay, I just wanted to say Kay isn't on, but if she were, say thank you very much to her great organizing job for the parade to Peggy's birthday and our
Yes.
singing in her front yard. It was, talked to Lisa later and found out that she was absolutely, at first she was confused, but afterwards she was absolutely thrilled by the whole thing and so happy at the number of cars that turned out.
Well, congratulations. That was a wonderful event where we had a drive-by birthday celebration for a 90th birthday. Dave, when you're 90, maybe they'll do it for us too.
Yeah, and I'd say she also did an excellent job with, Kay also did an excellent job with the weather because it was pouring on Wednesday.
The weather was great, and somebody, I think it was Mary, made a gorgeous cake for,
Yeah, I made a,
that was for Peggy and her family, not for us.
yeah, it was
That
a
was
little
great.
like chocolate cake with raspberry icing.
That's hard to beat.
I have a couple of things. First of all, I forgot to say during announcements that the walking club is this coming up Saturday at 10 o'clock. And I think we're going to Warwick Park, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the other two joys. One is that Lorian's Odyssey the Mind team got first place in regionals and is moving on to states. And also that RJ, who's a theater major at Temple, got into the acting concentration, which was a goal of his. So he's happy about that. We're happy about that.
Congratulations on all of those. Wow. These joys and these sorrows are part of the story of this whole community, and they are also part of the joys and the sorrows of all of humanity. Now, would you join with me for a time of meditation and a short silence? Spirit of life, as we approach the close of Women's History Month 2021, let us live in memory and hope. Let us remember the generations of women who were oppressed, attacked, mistreated for being who they were. Let us remember child brides denied an education, drudges of housework and caregiving kept from expressing their talents, women burned as witches and heretics. Let us remember especially the 6 Asian American women killed recently in Atlanta at the intersection of racism and sexism. And let us remember the heroic women who have gone before us, women who have engaged in the effort to make the world a better place for all people, the mothers of the civil rights struggle, the hidden figures of the early era of spaceflight, the modern Nobel scientists and the ancient Islamic grandmothers, the celebrated and the unknown who laid the foundations of the COVID vaccines. May these memories inspire hope in us. May we find ways to break the chains of sexism, racism, and all the false beliefs that blight lives and drain the vitality from human society. May we celebrate the lives of all humanity. Amen, shalom, salam, and blessed be. Will you join with me in a time of silence? Amen. Now, Linda Pale, I believe you have put the donation button available on the screen, on the chat. There she isn't.
Yeah. Yes, I have.
And you can find it on our website or send a check as you wish. But these words for our morning offering. We give because we are blessed by a community of memory and hope. We give because we have memories together and hopes in common. We give because we are needed by the world. The morning offering will be given and received with grace and gratitude. And Carly, will you play hymn number 107? Now sing we of the brave of old. Thank you, Carly. Well, here we are at the end of Women's History Month. They say that well-behaved women rarely make history. They, being in this case, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, a professor of early American history, who is often quoted on T-shirts and bumper stickers. Dorothea Dix certainly made history. Whether she was well-behaved or truly a dragon, I will leave it to you to decide. It's hard to imagine how much Dorothea Dix accomplished and how she accomplished it, given the conditions of the time and the constraints on women, the deficiencies of her upbringing, and her own physical ailments. She was ill and debilitated for years. She suffered from what must have been tuberculosis, and at one point she was functioning on only one lung. Nevertheless, Dorothea Dix lived from 1802 to 1887, from the early years of the American Republic through the trauma of the Civil War to nearly the end of the 19th century. And in that time, she brought about a revolution in the treatment of the mentally ill. She persuaded legislatures throughout the country to found hospitals and asylums for the mentally ill. She traveled thousands of miles alone at a time when roads were poor, coachmen unreliable, bandits abundant, and women were expected to be respectably escorted. And she was silent in public situations. She was a very shy person, and yet somehow she always found someone to speak for her, to make her views known insistently. Not to make a bad pun of it, Dorothea Dix worked tirelessly for the mentally ill, but I suspect she also drove people crazy. She was not the sort of person you could say no to. She was, you might say, a dragon. Perhaps she herself suffered from mental illness. Her sad childhood, her years of semi-invalidism, her periods of extreme energetic activism suggest bipolar illness, although I've seen no suggestion of a proper diagnosis. She had limitations. She traveled extensively in the pre-Civil War South, but she never spoke out against slavery. Whether this was a matter of conviction or bandwidth or caution, I do not know, but it was a limitation. The nurses who worked under her supervision in the Civil War called her Dragon Dix. But also, most importantly, she always embodied compassion. Compassion for those suffering from mental illness, compassion for their families and caretakers, and even compassion for their jailers. Now, we don't have time for a complete biography this morning, but let's look at some of the highlights of her life. Imagine little Dorothea, born to parents who could be described as feckless at best. Her grandparents were well off, but her alcoholic and abusive father barely scraped together a living as an itinerant preacher and a writer of fanatic religious tracts. Her mother suffered from vague illnesses that kept her on the couch. A large component of this illness must have been depression. Dorothea's job as a child was to stitch together those endless numbers of pamphlets, pushing a blunt needle through layers of stiff paper, to raise her little brothers and to keep the household going. She sounds like the stereotype of the eldest child in an alcoholic family. Dorothea eventually rescued herself by running away to her grandmother. She summed up these years by saying, "I never knew childhood." And still she learned and practiced compassion. She was a remarkable woman from a very early age. At 15, living with rich relatives who strove to turn her into a lady, Dorothea earned money by running a dame school, and that in those days was an informal school in which she taught young girls. Later, after her father died, Dorothea brought her younger brothers to Boston, to her grandmother's mansion, and again she opened a school in an empty outbuilding so that she could support them. She wrote several books, including a bestseller of its day. It was called Conversations on Common Things. It was a sort of encyclopedia, but it was cast as dialogues between a mother and a daughter, and it was filled with practical information about hundreds of subjects, from animals to chocolate to sculpture to zinc, A to Z, along with moral exhortations on nobility of character. This book stayed in print for 40 years, and between the sale of the books and her teaching and her eventual inheritance, Dorothea Dix was able to live modestly but independently for the rest of her life. She found Unitarianism on her own. It was the preaching of William Ellery Channing that spoke to something in Dorothea's young soul. This was the early days of Unitarianism, when it was first separated from the rest of the Christian denominations. After growing up with the gloomy hellfire and damnation religion of her father and the stern Calvinism of her grandparents, Dorothea responded to Channing's deeply joyous visions of faith. He had once written, "The Christian beholds unity in the midst of variety. He looks around on this changing scenery and to every leaf of the forest, every blade of grass, every hill, every valley, every cloud of heaven, and he discovers the traces of benign, divine benevolence. Creation is but a field spread before him for an infinitely varied display of love." You can imagine how this vision would appeal to Dorothea after the hardships of her young life. Dorothea Dix had been imprisoned in her young life in the years of no childhood. Channing's Unitarianism set her free, awakening and nurturing her own font of compassion. She became close to his family and spent some time as a governess to his children. And it was at the Channing's home that she met another young parishioner, Anne Heath, a young woman who had become her lifelong friend and correspondent, probably the most important relationship of her adult years. In Anne's large and cheerful family, Dorothea found a place where her own family had never provided. Her eyes were opened by these experiences. She saw beyond her own life and needs. She decided that in addition to her dame school, she must create a charity school for the children of the poor. Dorothea's grandmother and her cousin Edward, who was her secret fiancé, they discouraged this project. They didn't like the idea of ragged children, and they didn't like the idea of her risking her fragile health by working so hard. And they didn't like the idea of her inspiration by those Unitarians. She did it anyway, and she called her school the Hope. Her commitment to this project proved to be the end of her engagement, but perhaps the beginning of her true career as an activist and human rights worker. It was a young student at Harvard Divinity School who inadvertently set Dorothea Dix on her most important life's work. It began innocuously enough. He and his classmates had agreed to teach Sunday school classes at the East Cambridge jail. He was assigned to the women. It took only one class for him to figure out that they needed a mature woman as a teacher and not a young man. And so he came to Dorothea Dix, asking if she knew anyone. Needless to say, Miss Dix took the assignment herself. The class went well, with a lesson on Mary Magdalene and a hymn, and getting to know the women. But that was only the beginning. On the way out, she asked the jailer to see the rest of the jail. Oh, he said, this is no place for a woman. Dorothea pointed out that there were, in fact, women there. Dorothea got her tour. Then came the screaming. Oh, just one of the mad ones, ma'am, said the jailer. There's no keeping them quiet. Dorothea was horrified to learn that insane people, and that was just one of the terms they used then, people were being kept in the jail. What about asylums, she asked. Oh, those are only for the rich, she learned. These were paupers. She insisted on seeing them, and she got her way. A small bare room crowded with sufferers. No heat, drafty, no sanitary facilities. It was a nightmare. The jailer shrugged. Mad folk don't know hot from cold. And then the screaming began again. A woman. Dorothea insisted, and again she got her way. She was taken to a place with 2 pens. Here's how Dorothy Clark Wilson describes it. Inside one was the source of the screams, a raving maniac, wild-eyed, disheveled, naked but for a few filthy rags. In the other was a young woman who, except for a slight vagueness in her eyes, might have passed for sane. As screams and blasphemies issued from the other's lips, the young woman cowered as if subjected to physical blows and covered her ears. Dorothea Dix worked hard to improve the condition for the mentally ill at that jail. She brought warm clothing and demanded that a stove be provided, threatening to go to the authorities. The authorities weren't interested in the complaints of a woman, so she went to her minister, Dr. Channing, who calmly accepted Dorothea's sense of mission, assumed that of course she would take action, and put her in touch with prominent philanthropists, citizens who could bring a thorough picture before the citizens of Boston. The matter went to court, where Dorothea won the local battle, but then it became clear to her that the rest of the state was no better. The first thing she needed was a survey of the entire state, town by town, in person, to see what the actual need was. Then would come a bill to increase the space in the state hospital in Worcester. And so it began. Dorothea Dix began traveling alone through muddy and rutted roads. Her report to the legislature was called a memorial. Taunton, 1 woman caged. Plymouth, 1 man stall caged from Worcester Hospital. Barnstable, 4 females in pens and stalls. Wayland Almshouse, man caged in a woodshed, fully exposed to the public road. Confinement and cold so affected his limbs that he is often powerless to rise. Westford, young woman fastened to a wall with a chain. Lincoln, a woman in a cage. Medford, 1 idiotic subject chain and 1 in a close stall for 17 years. Williamsburg, the almshouse, several insane, not under suitable treatment. No apparent intentional abuse. Granville, 1 closely confined, now losing the use of his limbs from want of exercise. And so on and on. She visited every jail and almshouse in the state. This woman whose childhood had been blighted. This woman who had been so ill the doctors thought she might not live another year. This mere woman. Although Dorothea Dix wrote the report herself, Samuel Gridley Howe, a well-known philanthropist and teacher of the blind, presented it to the legislature on her behalf. Well-behaved ladies did not speak before the legislature. She met with individuals in small groups, but when a bill was before the legislators, Howe was in the State House. Dix was waiting in Dr. Channing's study. Despite reluctance and political machinations, the bill passed. Massachusetts improved its care for the mentally ill. But this was not the end of the campaign. Next came Rhode Island, then Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. She traveled to every state east of the Mississippi and some to the west, visiting jails, almshouses, making reports, convincing legislatures. She visited New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Jackson, Mississippi, Jefferson, Missouri, Alton, Illinois, and Little Rock in Arkansas. Never did she abandon her compassion. Despite her poor health, she kept traveling. She connected to people at every level of society. She persuaded reluctant wealthy men to give large sums of money, and she carried books for the enlightenment of the prisoners. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it was dangerous. Michigan was frontier territory in those days, but Dorothea Dix would not allow her coachman to carry firearms. She confiscated them and told him he could have them back at the end of the trip. One did not say no to Miss Dix. Inevitably, they met up with a bandit. The robber warned the driver not to reach for his guns. He would not believe that a passenger had them, and a woman passenger at that. Biographer Dorothy Clark Wilson imagines the interaction. "Are you not ashamed, my good man, to rob a woman?" She answered him. "I have but little money, and I needed to defray my expenses in visiting prisons and poorhouses, and occasionally in giving to objects of charity. But if you have been unfortunate and are in distress and in want of money, I will gladly give you some." The would-be robber was stunned. He recognized that quiet, steely voice. When he had been in the Philadelphia penitentiary, he had overheard her talking with prisoners, speaking kindly, giving advice. You may go on," he said with deep emotion. "Please forgive me for the outrage I have committed." But the woman was not ready to go on. "I want to give you something," she said, "some money to support you until you can get honest employment." One did not say no to Dorothea Dix. By 1845, she wrote, "I have traveled over 10,000 miles in the last 3 years. I have visited 18 penitentiaries, 100 country jails and houses of correction, more than 500 almshouses and other institutions, besides hospitals and houses of reform. I've been so happy to promote and secure the establishment of 6 hospitals for the insane, several county poorhouses, several jails on a reformed plan." She even got a bill pushed through the United States Congress to set aside large amounts of land for the care of the mentally ill, but it was vetoed by the president. Nevertheless, in 1843, there were 13 mental hospitals in the country. By 1880, there were 123, and Dorothea Dix played a direct role in founding 32 of them. In 1857, she was invited to visit one Dr. Elwin's fledgling school for so-called mental defectives in Philadelphia. She was instrumental in finding them a new 300-acre site for an enlarged institution just outside of Media, and in obtaining funding from the legislature. Today, Elwin, on those 300 acres, is a leader in education, treatment, and supportive services to children and adults with autism, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and related behavioral health challenges. Besides her passionate work for the mentally ill and her work as superintendent of nursing, she worked in education for the blind and prison reform. The State Women's House Leadership Project in Trenton has in Trenton, New Jersey, has all of this on their website. The Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, she called her firstborn, and there she lived out her last years in an apartment under the eaves that was set aside for her. She died in 1887, and the bulk of her estate, after bequests to friends in several institutions, went to scholarship funds. So what became of all her work? Getting the mentally ill out of jails, out of cages, into clean, warm hospitals, places with wholesome food and decent conditions, with books and sometimes with light employment. This was a great improvement for the patients and for their families. Sometimes people got better. Sometimes they spent their whole lives in hospitals. By the middle of the 20th century, however, conditions had often deteriorated. Wholesale warehousing was common. Whole lifetimes were lost in the oblivion of repressive asylums with inadequate therapy. And then came a new era of drug therapy for mental illness. People who had been warehoused could often function in society or on the fringes of it. By the 1970s, hospitals were closing. A friend of mine was a law student at the time, part of a team springing people from hospitals. And into what? The idea would be that there would be halfway houses and community mental health facilities. Too often, there was nothing but the street. People fell back into illness, but no one took care of them. No one looked to see that they had those more effective medications. Back in 1838, the law required family members to be responsible for those with mental illness. In the 19th century, there wasn't much available by way of treatment. Families were left on their own to do the best they could with their family members, and it wasn't enough. Building that hospital, for instance, in Little Rock was a big improvement. And when Dave and I were serving the Fayetteville Fellowship in Arkansas, it was still where people had to go halfway across the state if they had a mental health crisis. And still, there are inadequate resources for families struggling to help a mentally ill loved one. Have we made progress in the last century and a half? It's hard to say. It would take a serious historical investigation to make a comprehensive look at this view. The massive deinstitutionalization of the mid-20th century freed many people from mental hospitals, but it gave them very little support. The Peterson KFF Health System Tracker, that's on a website, gives a picture of how mentally ill people are faring, and thanks to historian Amanda Seligman for helping me define all of this. In the early 2000s, over half of those incarcerated in state and local prisons had a mental health problem within the year. Serious mental illness, substance abuse, or both may affect up to half of adults in homeless shelters. 1 in 5 Americans report that they or a family member did not receive treatment that they needed. About 35% of adults with serious mental illness are not receiving mental health treatment. Jails, prisons, homeless shelters, the street. It doesn't sound a whole lot better than the conditions Dorothea Dix found in the 20th century. Treatment options have improved, but they're not always available. Would this week's horrific grocery store shooting in Boulder have been avoided if the shooter had had adequate treatment or had been unable to obtain lethal weapons? We still have not reached a state in which people with mental illness live in safety and humane conditions and are kept from harming themselves or others. Progress, but uneven and not what it ought to be. Dorothea Dix traveled all of those thousands of miles alone. She began great work and made great strides. She couldn't speak directly to the legislatures. Those conditions have changed. Women can now not only speak publicly, but can serve in those lawmaking bodies and as governors and as vice president of the US. So progress. But again, it was uneven and not what it ought to be. Just like everything else in women's history. Dorothea Dix is standing before us, a Unitarian committed to living out her faith. Can we do less? As we begin to think about returning to a post-pandemic world, I invite you to consider how we may take this opportunity to shift the course of history, to live not towards business as usual, but to live out our compassion, to feel with the families struggling to support their loved ones, to find ways in our life to reach for our highest values. Maybe we be inspired by Dorothea Dix. May we rise above the constraints of our lives, remembering that those constraints are so much easier than the challenges of Dorothea's life. May we find ways to live out our best values and make this world better for all people. Amen. Carly, will you play our closing hymn, These Things Shall Be, number 138? The closing words are from John Greenleaf Whittier, and they were placed on a plaque on a fountain that Dorothea Dix donated for thirsty animals in Customs House Square in Boston. It reads, "Stranger and traveler, drink freely and bestow a kindly thought upon her who bade this fountain flow, yet hath for it no claim, save as the minister of blessing in God's name. May we also be ministers of blessing. Amen, shalom, salam, and blessed be."